Everybody, and welcome to the Human-ish podcast. My name is Dine, and our guest today is Dr. Gita Vaid. Gita is a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist specializing in ketamine assisted psychotherapy. Is currently controlling trials with the MAPS Institute in MDMA and its link with trauma. Gita, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on your show today. It's exciting to be part of this podcast.
It's a pleasure. So the reason I wanted to have you on the show specifically is because I believe that psychedelics are key, or at least one of the keys to unlocking the mysteries of consciousness. And as someone, handling them so intimately, your perspective is valuable. So how did you get in? How did psychedelics come into your life in terms of like psychoanalysis?
Well, I have a similar interest. I have to say I was very taken also by your last podcast talking about consciousness and psychedelics. And I agree with you. I think psychedelics are an extraordinary tool to explore the mysteries of consciousness. And actually one of the early pioneers, Stan Grof, who is a real pioneer and visionary really in the field of psychedelic psychotherapy, really used the comparison of how psychedelics to the field of psychiatry, and I would expand that to say consciousness exploration, is really like the equivalent of the microscope is to biology or the telescope is to astronomy. And so I think it is a very valuable tool to really tap into different access of human consciousness and experience.
So,
but to go, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask, because as psychedelics are, relatively new to our current culture. So what frameworks do you have to make sense of the psychedelic experience then?
Well, the frameworks that I'm employing really, and as you said, in that podcast, they are new to this culture, but have been used in traditions for millennia. So there are many frameworks and many different cultural perspectives that inform maps with which and lenses with which to organize and orient oneself within the psychedelic experience and encounter. The maps that I lean on really are much more psychologically based maps, because those are the maps that I have, used to really organize human experience. But I think it really shifts the rules and opens it up to a much deeper access, which go beyond current thinking with psychological frameworks and maps. And I think that's what's so exciting, because suddenly an experience of awareness beyond some of the self-structures we live in and some of the everyday experience, it's not so much limited to waking state and daydreams and sleep states. Suddenly there's a whole access to consciousness or a self beyond those constraints or narratives we live in.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that because I think there's this conception that our normal everyday consciousness is the one that we should stay at, and because it's good for survival, and that's our safe space. So what value does it add to go into these non-normal states of consciousness where our body isn't normal, operational as normal?
Well, for one, I think it's incredibly healing. And I think that it's not as finely demarcated as it might appear. I think actually all of us have access to different levels of consciousness. Sometimes they're not identified as such, but I think a lot of people, when they embark in what they think of as flow experience, that could be in sports, or it could be listening to music. It could be in even simple as going to a football match where you're part of a group and have a real collective experience, or a rave or a dance music festival. These are all different places where individuals, without even recognizing it as such, enter into different states of consciousness experience or ego dissolution, dance parties. So I think that, we, without even knowing it, a lot of meditators, so it's not just psychedelics that offer roots in. Psychedelics tends to be a very lazy, easy way to get into these different states of consciousness. But there are many everyday occurrences which many people are very skilled at expanding their levels of experience, awareness, and consciousness, perhaps without even recognizing it as such.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to build on the healing component. Can you give us a taste of your practice and what happens, you know, so the sort of steps and what it would take to administer somebody with ketamine?
Absolutely. So to first clarify the healing aspect of it, you know, there is, you know, one of the premises really behind a lot of the trials or the MAPS work particularly is the kind of notion of inner healing intelligence, which is actually a concept that was really Stan Grof identified. And I think just a way of explaining that is that the human body is very, very complex. And we're quite sophisticated, you know, in medicine these days. But if you actually break it down, there is not much that we can actually heal in medicine. We really just remove obstacles towards healing. The body itself is what heals.
Yeah.
So if there is an infection, we can remove an infectious agent by giving antibiotics, but the body heals itself. Or if there is a broken bone, it's the body that heals itself. We just remove anything like an infection or any kind of dirt or any kind of obstacles that towards healing. The healing process itself is an inherent property of the body. And same with the mind. You know, the idea is when we have trauma or problems or depression, that is a symptom or expression of something wrong. But given the right conditions, the mind knows how to heal too. And so as a practitioner, one really has to listen and try and understand what are the obstacles, what are the conditions that we can create towards healing. So it's a very different model of healing and mind and body. And it does really seem to be this tremendous research that psychedelics can provide really exceptional conditions for not only access to studying oneself, becoming aware, expanding states of consciousness, but also those within those conditions, the conditions are really ripe for correction and repair and self-healing. So that's one thread that psychedelics really allow for, to really drop out of some of the constraints that we live in mind, body, and spirit, and allow for almost a homeostasis, regulation, correction. One can leverage that with the interaction between therapist and patient. And then there's also the just pharmacological effect of a lot of these medicines have very potent anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects. So it's important because they're being studied for actually a spectrum of those different pieces.
So do you see thoughts as a homeostatic process as body temperature is?
Do I see thoughts?
Yeah.
I think thoughts are, I don't think of them as homeostasis. I think if you get beyond that, you can get to a state where one is not distracted, very much like meditation. I think there have been so many studies looking of the healing potential of meditation.
Yeah.
So it's getting into a deep meditative state, which I think is very healing, and there's lots of studies to support that. Psychedelics put you into that state very, very quickly, and actually even beyond that.
Okay. So I suppose it's the stillness of the meditative state that you're sort of trying to aim at for the healing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And more than that, that's one piece. I think there are other things that one can also tap into. You know, also a break free from the time out from ordinary thinking mind, a way of really accessing a self beyond the narratives we live in. And then it's quite powerful for someone to experience a sense of being and awareness beyond some of the stories that and the stories and life events and circumstances and the cards one was dealt. It really gives one a sense of agency to write their own story instead of being conditioned into the stories of what happened in our past. So that can be another very powerful kind of liberation. Then there's also the issue of our sense of self and identity, how it's very interesting how much happens in life. We can have all sorts of triumphs and successes and good experience, but it's remarkable how little of that really shapes one's sense of self. Most of our sense of self are constructed from very early experiences. So even I've had work with people, which I don't think is an uncommon experience, who've had so many successes and triumphs, but still feel not good enough, or still feel poorly about themselves because of early life experiences, projections that were put into them, early experiences that really created that sense of identity. And so this gives one a possibility of upgrading that, actually, to really get beyond and really take in a different sense of oneself, which is more current and less based on past conditioning.
So, on the subject of the self, it's common to view, like, and based on what you said, it's justified that the self is a constant in your experience, right? Because you're always viewing things from your own perspective. So, but then there's the other component, which is the self must be dynamic in some way. Biological systems are dynamic, and the self is a product of a biological system. Do you think there's a difference between sort of the self and consciousness? And can you speak to the sort of, if there is, the dynamic nature of the self?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's complicated because we are very complicated, and there is a sense of self we all carry around. But even that, when you scrutinize it, is much more complex. We have a self when we're scared, and that looks very different than a self when we're feeling very safe and creative. And then we have our best selves, who we are when we feel supported and mature, and who are we when we regress and become very infantile. We all have these different selves, really, which are a collection of different development levels of ourselves, given different conditions and circumstances, which are reliable enough and characteristic enough that our family and friends and ourselves recognize them. So the self itself is very fluid. In some ways, we're a kind of collection of different levels of ourselves, as well as a archaeological kind of expression of our childhood histories and narratives and circumstances. And that's alive and moving and interfacing with environment. So we are really a complex living system. I think what psychedelics can really offer us is a different perspective on all of those components, to not be so within it, to actually be able to have a sense of an experience and cultivate an awareness of how that whole system works, and that there is still a witness to the whole circus that constructs oneself. And that can be incredibly powerful. And in terms of where in consciousness this all is, I think it's all consciousness. I think consciousness, we are an experiencing consciousness.
Do you think consciousness necessarily has to be embodied? So, cause the reason I ask this is because a consistent experience of the ketamine, trip is out of body experiences. I hear about that a lot. So, is consciousness necessarily have to come from a body? In my opinion, my opinion usually has been that it has, because you have to experience from a perspective. And the perspective of a human is the body. But with ketamine, it's interesting, and not just ketamine, also psilocybin, that you can have an out-of-body experience. So what are the implications of an out-of-body experience in terms of how you understand consciousness?
Well, I think this is an unanswerable question, right? There are people who really feel like it really is a product of brain. Consciousness is a phenomenon of brain, and even an experience of being out of body is still an experience created by brain, versus the idea that the brain is a receptor to receive experiences of consciousness, as opposed to being caused by consciousness, kind of like the idea of a television itself is not creating the images on the screen, it's just receiving them. And so those are two different paradigms that get into much bigger questions and philosophies.
Okay.
And I don't think it's necessarily answerable, but
yeah, well, I don't suppose I'm looking for an answer, but
I would say Psychedelic Experience definitely throws questions into this question. It definitely disrupts the idea that can seem very tight and neat, and the scientific rules. It definitely disrupts that, or makes it harder to explain some of the phenomena that we're talking about. So I think that it does, a lot of people feel like, it just breaks the rules of science, whether those are just scrambling receptors in the brain, create all sorts of strange experiences that we try and weave together into coherent stories. versus these are experiences that can't be explained because they're beyond the scope of some of the paradigms we live in, is debatable. But I would say it's a common experience that people have after psychedelic experience, that it really does break a lot of the rules and a lot of the access and a lot of the frameworks we live in, that it really gets into at the very least, fuller access of human potential, and sometimes even feels like it's beyond human potential. And ketamine is a really good medicine for that, because it can, at different doses, really take one to experiences beyond the thinking mind into connection with deeper creative sensual intelligence that resides within the body. And then if you go further, it can go all to the periphery of sense of self, to even beyond self, an experience beyond self, or if you go beyond that, to really very, very strange experiences in consciousness, which sometimes are very difficult to language, and sometimes can have mystical kind of experiences of unity and oneness, which actually has been associated in many of the psilocybin studies at Johns Hopkins with well-being and antidepressant effect and good outcomes in terms of well-being and mental health.
So then how does ketamine compare to sort of MDMA and psilocybin? Is there a measurable difference?
It's a very different experience, and it works very differently in the brain. So it's quite different in its experience. I think it's a dissociative medicine. So it's quite different in terms of the psychedelic experience, in terms of the atmosphere. And so there are different ways to have an experience. I always use the metaphor, it's a little bit like going to Europe. It's hard to compare Italy to France to Germany, but they all are Europe, and they're different ways, and there's really a different atmosphere in each of them. So it's something like that. Each of them have a different signature of experience, but there are overlaps in terms of some of the implications, in terms of expanding consciousness, detaching from our stories, connecting with different levels of awareness, having insight, really being able to shift perspectives. You know, all of these stories and perspectives we're locked into. Sometimes it's really amazing to have access to one's life story from a whole different vantage point, and to remember a whole different series of experiences that then can be organized to really rethink how one is experiencing themselves or their life story, or then their lenses with which they understand and orient in life and in the world.
So, I mean, the psychedelic experience then is, there's a lot of information. It's a completely new perspective and somewhat chaotic. I don't suppose you can predict what the person is going to experience. So as a psychiatrist, how do you make sense of the experience, or how do you help the patient make sense of the experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It really changes the way in which one operates within psychotherapy. So as a sort of psychoanalyst or as a psychiatrist, a lot of what I've been trained and have developed to use myself as an instrument in healing or in analyzing or in using the transference, the dynamics in the room with people are still actually applicable. It's just all the rules change and the whole roles change. In some ways, I would say, just to use broad strokes, it really changes the therapist to be the person themselves. They are their own guide. They are their own healer. And it changes the psychiatrist or the psychotherapist into a supporter. I feel like I'm very good at listening to the person and trying to understand how I can facilitate the unfolding of their own process. When I say listening, it's not just listening to the communication verbally, but also the derivatives within it, which is what I'm trained to do. But this goes even further than to listening to what the body is saying. Sometimes there's an expression and a language that is communicated through the body, as well as through the language of the words, and also through listening in at different levels of experience. And analysts are pretty well trained to do this, but this takes it to a whole different level of listening where you can use more of yourself to listen. So that's, or bringing attention for the person to listen to themselves. And this gets back into connecting more deeply with oneself. And I think there's a real expansion and enrichment in that, versus the divided way we all are trained and conditioned to live and manage life. Which is why, a lot of the studies do look like, I don't know if you've seen some of the incredible imaging studies of the unified brain, and how much of the brain can actually light up. I mean, it doesn't tell the full story, but it's a nice kind of image to show, or at least the metaphor of how much our brains are disconnected, and how much you can have awe and different experiences when more of the connections are and inputs are put together, very much like the analogy is a child's brain, how excitement and in awe a child is of the world, where some of these fixed ways of thinking are not so set in stone.
Yeah, so their experience is less filtered almost. Like, well, one thing I hear about some psychedelic experiences is that, like, color becomes more vibrant, for example. So I suppose you could speak to this as a psychoanalyst, but maybe you build these filters as life goes on.
Yes, very much so. And so it's amazing to have this kind of expansive experience. I would say, just to break it down to what the experience looks like in the consulting room with low-dose ketamine, oftentimes I would say the focus I have to try and bring it and ground it more in a clinical applicability is an experience of what it is to be safe within yourself, which seems like a really easy thing to say, well, we all feel safe, but actually it's amazing how much anxiety we all walk around with, or even if we are numbing ourselves from the anxiety by having a few drinks or taking some anti-anxiety medications, it's not the same thing. Really, this gets into feeling safe, meaning how much we are all a living system where we have our whole set of coping sort of behaviors and defenses up. And so even when we're safe, we get kind of imprisoned by our defenses. And very much, I guess the equivalent would be if you pick up a baby. You're not trying to do anything differently, but because the baby is undefended, you might notice, if you pay attention to your body, your whole nervous system calms down and you feel very open, and you're not doing anything. It's just by resonance, because the baby is so open and undefended biologically in sympathy, all your defenses fall away. And it's very hard to find many instances when that happens. Well, psychedelics are one of those. Your whole body relaxes with ketamine, and your mind relaxes, and you just have so much more access to yourself. And in that open field, you can really feel the other person, and vice versa. So it's a really beautiful, emotionally connected experience, and there's a healing in that. A lot of therapy winds up being the dance between the therapist and the patient, and a lot of talking. But then there is the transference and the emotional experience, which most analysts would say is one of the pearls of a treatment, is that level of discourse, not necessarily the thinking, analyzing part, as much as the real relationship in the here and now. And suddenly with psychedelics, you're in the deepest of experience on that level, which can be incredibly healing and corrective. There's a real corrective experience. There's a real experience of oneself free of anxiety in a highly creative state, where all the energy that is put towards safety and survival and defenses gets channeled towards emergence and creativity and experience. And so even to experience oneself in that way can be very, very powerful. It starts opening new paths and new ways of being, and then begs the question, just implicitly, of why am I not in this state more often? Right? So I think that is such a powerful experience, to even know what it is to be and to feel so fully alive in that state, and to carry that forward. And then oftentimes one can, having those new pathways opened up, get back there, or reboot those experiences through listening to the same soundtrack, music, meditation. I'm a big advocate of meditation.
Yeah.
It's very frequent that meditators find that their meditation is enhanced from being in an experience such as this. And
do you mean meditation whilst they're tripping, or meditation afterwards?
Subsequent, yes. And also individuals who haven't been able to meditate because their minds are too busy will be surprised that they actually feel they can carry with them the experience of a quiet mind into practice, where they feel like for the first time they're able to sit and be still, be in presence for 10 minutes, 15 minutes downstream. So I really try and support that to try and keep the process going.
Yeah, I mean, well, what you said is reminded me of a notion that I've had before, which is that, you know, as human beings, we're geared to survive, right? The reason we eat so much food all the time is because we want to get all those calories, because our bodies still think we're in this hunter-gatherer like framework. And I think consciousness is in the same way, where we want to perceive time in a certain way, we want to perceive space in a certain way, so we can, you know, detect threats or hunt. But as a society now, I feel like we have the freedom to explore consciousness, and psychedelics give us that. So like off that, I have what I want to ask is, do you think psychedelics can add value for the average person? And if so, like, because obviously the, you know, access is restricted, how could the average person take advantage of psychedelics?
Well, I think that's a difficult question, because I do feel psychedelics can be incredibly beneficial. I also think that they are strong medicines and you can get into trouble with psychedelics. So I think that I think you have to be careful with anything. There can be problems and side effects and contraindications. So I think if someone is interested in a psychedelic experience, first you have to ask the question, is it suitable for you? Are you a candidate for it? Because there are some people where I feel like it wouldn't be a good idea to take a psychedelic, which doesn't mean to say that there aren't other ways to access non-ordinary states and healing. As I said, psychedelics are one way, but there is also meditation, there's also holotropic breath work. So I think that, you know, we have to see what is one appropriate at this moment in time for a psychedelic. And then the other issue is how to create the right set and setting, because the medicine is one piece, the set and setting is another piece. And so there are a lot of reports of difficult experiences or problematic experiences that could have been avoided if the right set, the right setting, the right guide, the right preparation were in place. So I guess that's an answer to what if someone wants to take a medicine, is I think first I would advise caution, because I think these are very powerful medicines and you need to find the right framework and also understand what is the reason to doing them. Some of it could be recreational, but then also to distinguish, recreational is not the same as therapeutic necessarily. There could be an overlap. There also could be, you know, I have worked with people who were very nervous because they said they have had experience in the past with psychedelics in college and had a terrifying experience, and that then is a turn off to even trying a medicine at this point in their life. So, you know, I think you have to be careful, and I'm very conservative by nature and very cautious. So I think it's important to really become educated and find the right context if one is going to try and explore.
Yeah. I mean, there's this notion that sort of, I mean, I don't have as much experience, but that there's no such thing as a bad trip, only sort of an informative one, right? So you having a bad trip is informative of some things you have in your head. Do you agree with that? Like, have you had patients that have had a bad trip when in your setting?
I think that's right, what you're saying. I also think that there are certain people I would say I wouldn't even want to invite them into a psychedelic experience, because I feel like there's enough of concern that I feel like, you know, to use these sessions really well, ideally it would be good if you have certain strengths available to be able to make sense, make meaning, and be able to use the experience usefully. Like an immature ego, for example, I feel like, you know, there's a certain level of maturity. Like, that's why I don't think it's a good idea for kids to be using psychedelics.
Yeah.
Generally speaking. And so there's certain pieces you want to make sure are in place. It could be informative, but some of it is how do you maximize it? How do you do it safely? I think you also can have traumatizing experiences. It really is an amplifier, these medicines, which can be amazing to learn from. But if you have a lot of trauma in you, a traumatic experience, and you can get overwhelmed, a lot of it has to do with thresholds. And so can you leverage the experience to work through it? Or are you going to re-experience it just to get re-traumatized? So some of these issues have to be considered.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. And
I think it's very interesting. Actually, I have one person, I'll give you an example, maybe this will help a little bit. One person actually told me about, she wound up taking, I think, LSD at a music concert. Her boyfriend sort of said, hey, this is great for music, and took it. And it was really interesting because she said that she found herself going down a road of childhood sexual abuse that she had really thought she had dealt with many years ago, and had put it behind her. And then to suddenly find this becoming available to her in a very present way in the middle of a music festival was not what she wanted to be doing.
Yeah, for sure,
and was completely freaked out by it, and hadn't even really remembered it so much because it was really, she felt in her experience, put away with. Now you could see, as it turned out in that moment, she was able to comfortably navigate away from it, and her boyfriend was very supportive of her, but you could see that was a potential moment where something very untoward could have happened for her. Could there have been therapeutic benefit? She said, absolutely. Now I understand why you're interested in psychedelics, because I could see, had I been in a therapy office, had I been working with you, that could have been really interesting to go down that road. But at that point, she was totally freaked out and could have had, she didn't, but she could have had a very difficult experience being at a music festival and then being flooded with memories of a serious trauma.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm talking about, how, well, any experience is not a bad experience. I would say, well, I kind of feel like in theory and practice, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong.
Yeah, for sure. The research now is pointing towards that we need a cult, like sort of a wisdom around the use of psychedelics. And as a society, I feel like, previous societies have had like shamans and elders to guide people through the psychedelic experiences. Do you think that it's necessarily you'll need psychoanalysts to guide people through the psychedelic experience? Like what prerequisites are there for, to be a guide in that experience?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that's what we're dealing with now. Certainly, I would say in the US, I'm based in New York, there's a lot of different movements going on here. I'm less conversant with what's happening in different places in the world, but this is a big conversation, and certainly with what's happening with cannabis in the United States sets some precedent. But there are some states now which have decriminalized psilocybin, and then they're thinking about, well, if psilocybin is legalized, what are the provisions that need to be in place to ensure safe administration? And what kind of support is required? Does it require a medical degree? Does it require any therapist? Or what kind? So these questions are really being considered now in different ways at different levels. And it's all really tentative, and I think are trying to be sorted through. And I think some of it is because there's different indications, and I think there's different approaches which can be valuable for a spectrum of different ways of using these medicines and traditions. So I think that this is a very current conversation that I think is going to be interesting to listen and understand how they can be safely dispensed in a way that can be useful for the public.
Yeah.
Perhaps in different contexts, perhaps not just limited to medical offices, although of course that's the perspective that I'm involved with. It certainly isn't the only perspective, and there are a lot of ancient traditions that have used these medicines in churches and in ceremony with incredible impact for communities and deep cultural roots and traditions that are very valuable, that we can learn from and hopefully respect and honor and create frameworks to have not just be diminished in this conversation, but also respected and supported.
Do you think there is a danger of that, sort of the diminishing of non-scientific approaches to the psychedelic experience? Like my worry, not worry, but my thought, I'm thinking of the ayahuasca ceremonies that are still happening in Peru with the shamans. And I mean, there's the one side where it's getting sort of hijacked by fake shamans, but then I'm worried maybe in the future it may not seem legitimate, because talking about energy and spirits doesn't seem legitimate to the normal, rational, skeptical observer.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful, because some of these things can be parodied and some of the value can be lost, but there is real wisdom and knowledge which has been cultivated, and some of that might require an education to really understand really the richness that is being communicated and to respect it. So I think that it does become a question of how can we hold on to and value these traditions instead of taking from them without really understanding the full value of what's already been established and cultivated.
Yeah, it's almost like, I suppose the worry is sort of a gentrification almost, like, of things like the ayahuasca ceremony. Okay, so I mean, moving on to something vastly different but still related. What's your opinion on microdosing? Do you think, like, because I haven't seen many scientific studies, supporting microdosing, but there are anecdotal accounts saying that it's useful. Like, have you come across microdosing? Do you use it?
Well, I would say, there need to be more studies for sure, because the studies are quite mixed, even though there is a lot of, as you're saying, anecdotal studies. So it would be nice to have studies. And I know there are a lot of plans for studies with microdosing, particularly of LSD. And a lot of it is, but also psilocybin and other medicines, to really look at, can they be used to treat symptoms? A lot of it is for enhancement, and some of it is for symptom relief. I would say personally, in terms of how I used it, well, I do use ketamine. I wouldn't say microdosing is quite how I use it, but I have found ketamine can be used oftentimes very successfully to manage symptoms of depression and anxiety. It's fairly with regularity. I can have people do a session every several weeks with ketamine and have been able to come off their antidepressants and sustain symptom remission, be it depressive or panic attacks or anxiety symptoms, through the ongoing effects of ketamine, not necessarily at high doses, but at intermittent doses. It's not one that I prescribe on a daily basis for a variety of reasons, but it is one that can really shift the way in which one can use these medicines for symptom relief and treatment.
So then, most people will look at depression and automatically think of antidepressant. How would you tackle that? Because to me, antidepressants aren't always the answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that ketamine is a very potent antidepressant and has been established as a really good treatment for treatment-resistant depression. So that is, and I think that the psychedelics have been shown to have powerful antidepressant effect. What's exciting about them is they have very different mechanisms of action. But as a psychoanalyst, I still very much hold on to trying to respect the sculpture of the self and the meaning behind symptoms. And if someone is depressed, in addition to even prescribing an antidepressant, I would like to invite someone into an inquiry into what's going on in themselves that accounts for the depression, or what shifts can be made on a more foundational level to sort out deeper kind of understanding and healing towards their symptom and their presentation. And that there is a wisdom behind their symptoms, as opposed to just an inconvenience, that perhaps that this is their being telling them something's wrong. And how do we understand that? Or is there an addiction to that? Or is this a residue from the past? Or is this an identification? So that perspective is really my orientation anyway, working with individuals and including reflecting on myself. Psychedelics, I think, just open the scope of access and repair that's possible. So if anything, I think it just allows me to feel even more confidently. You can really have a chance to go into this and really respect and understand where some of these difficulties are arising from, how much they can be managed at a different level, not only for medication and treatment, but also for deeper healing. But you're right, a lot of, there is a trend as well to just think of it as a biological problem, that this is a chemical imbalance and that one could write a prescription to correct it. And that's a different approach, right? A much more biological approach. And there is a discourse in psychiatry of the biological psychiatrists versus the psychological ones. Usually there's an overlap because it's the mind and body, but then you can have, as in anything, extremists. So I definitely am much more, I do believe in the biology of the brain, but I'm much more interested really in how much plasticity there is, how to get to the psychological holding of these patterns and the sculptures we live in, how much flexibility there is to change and use medicines to manage symptoms, but also to promote change and shifting and trying to heal on these core levels that to me are much more interesting, how to use the relationship to facilitate that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like the distinction between mind and body, I get, like we've talked about this before, but it's useful. But I feel like viewing them as separate is a limitation. Uh, it seems to me like your approach is viewing them together is what's moving us forward.
I appreciate you thinking that. I agree. I think in medicine we've gotten so subspecialized. You know, we don't think of ourselves as one organism. If you have a problem with 3 parts of your body, you go to 3 different doctors, and probably then you're going to see 3 other subspecialists, which is wonderful because it shows how much refinement and sophistication there can be. On the other hand, there's a cost to that. I think we miss the big picture of how we are one organism, and the mind and body. I think very much aspects of the same thing. I mean, we hold our sense of ourselves in our minds and in our stories as well as in our body. And I think psychedelics really illustrate that oftentimes, actually. It's one of the most colorful aspects, I think, of psychedelics is the experience of actually seeing the poetry in the body. Now, I think we live in that every day, but to have access to some of the poetry that resides in our body, oftentimes I think it shifts some of our sessions to being that I work with. I feel like I'm always amazed at the wisdom of the body and a person's life story and how they hold it in their body. And for them to discover it and to be in awe of it is no less stunning to both of us, actually, to hear how much we hold, and trauma, how it's held in the body too, and in physical places. And it's quite extraordinary. It also reveals how little we know about the human condition.
Yeah. See, when you say stories and poetry, I'm a rookie, but you remind me of sort of Carl Jung. Does he inform your psychoanalysis at all?
Very much. I do feel like actually I was trained in a very conservative, much more kind of Freudian-based psychoanalytic tradition. So it's interesting to, you know, and I really am a big fan of Sigmund Freud's work.
Yeah.
That being said, it does feel very much we're in the collective Carl Jung world, which is exciting because, you know, in many ways, I would say one of the things I love about psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory, as well as sessions as dreams. I've always been drawn towards dream work and the symbolism in dreams and the richness of dreams, how every element in a dream, if one associates to it, is infused with so much information condensed into one piece. And of course, this is not just dreams. This is true of any conscious experience. If we really examine it, when you come into a psychoanalyst office, if someone starts talking about the weather, you know, of all the millions of things they could talk about, why are they talking about the weather? There's usually, if you go into it, some significance of what that is symbolizing or representing for the individual. And in some ways, I feel like psychedelic experience is almost like entering into a dream state with the person, except for they're in it with you and you're invited into this incredible, rich inner world of another person where you can actually participate in it. So to me, it's the most extraordinary experience and so rich and so exciting. But when I say that, I also would say, you know, I think that we all have access to these different dream states, and a lot of the big discoveries that people make in advancing human innovation, it's interesting how many of these discoveries come from non-ordinary places. There is so much intelligence in thinking and problem solving, but actually a lot of creativity resides in the body, in the soma, in these other states where oftentimes people will say, I think J.K. Rowling once, if I remember correctly, reading an article, she said Harry Potter, it was almost like dropped out from nowhere as almost like a book. She had the whole story. And it reads that way. It reads when you read it. The characters seem well developed, even if they appear very little in book 1, but in book 3. Yeah. And it wasn't something she sat through and mapped out and developed and thought about as much as she did. She didn't. And I think we see that a lot with creativity, that creativity has different set of rules. It's not so much a linear problem-solving process. And I think artists speak to this a lot, you know, how their process is as different. I think oftentimes it is tapping into these non-ordinary creative states, which are much more, oftentimes people will have a dream where they feel they got the answer in a dream, or they had a premonition. This gets into intuition. Right. And so I think this is the space we're talking about that can be accessed and really harnessed, which I think is, you know, Freud talked about dreams being the royal road to the unconscious. I think psychedelics offer something even more extraordinary, because you're right in that dream creative space, and it feels very, very exciting, very rich, and also it feels like a privilege to really support someone in that place, because it feels very spiritual to be in this kind of landscape with a person trying to support them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. This is an obvious question. It doesn't interest me too much, but I mean, the most people, they look at psychedelics. They're an illegal class A, I think, drug in the UK, depending on where you are. Can you just calm the population down in terms of the negative side effects? What are the negative side effects of psychedelics, both physical and mental?
They're very safe medicines. I mean, I feel like as a psychiatrist, I mean, I prescribe a lot of medications, and all of those medicines, even the safe ones, can have untoward side effects. So I always say any medication, even something as over the counter, if you're sensitive or allergic, you can have a bad reaction.
Yeah.
So you have to be cautious with any substance you're putting in your body. So, there is that caveat. So can you have a problem with it? Well, anything can cause a problem, an allergic reaction, a bad reaction, a toxic reaction. That being said, psychedelics, when used safely in the right individuals, really are very safe medicines. And I think there's been a lot, of conversation about how alcohol is much more dangerous than psychedelics. They are safe. It's really hard to overdose on these medicines, although of course one can if taking too much of anything. But they're very safe medicines when used cautiously, and they tend to have a very low addictive potential. Ketamine has more of an addictive potential than the others, but in general they can be, really used very responsibly. And I think that some of this gets into what the intention is, right? I think that I see people all the time getting into trouble with behaviors, like you can be addicted to shopping, or food or sex. So anything, including psychedelics or any substance or any behavior, can be used to evade knowledge and to escape. And that can be a problem. So I think you see examples of that with everything. But generally speaking, I would say in the spectrum, psychedelics are very safe. But a lot of the problem has to do with legal. I don't endorse doing anything illegal or anything criminal. And a lot of it has to do with the fear of them and some of the politics behind them, which I'm hoping some of the recent studies will allow us to open up these medications to have them be less restricted, so at the very least they can be studied more easily and accessed in safe environments for individuals to really use them very carefully for deeper exploration and healing.
That's
and there
brilliant.
are other organizations looking into legalization and deeper access. And I think that it's interesting trying to unravel from the politics of the past. It's a really interesting history psychedelics have.
Yeah. Okay. And I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for.